is, well, the fresh sanctions that US President Joe Biden seems to have imposed on his way out. 10 days before he demits office, he has imposed Washington's harshest set of sanctions on Russian oil entities. Sanctioned two major Russian entities and roughly 183 oil tankers, a move that could hurt both China as well as India. These are the largest buyers of Russian oil since the Ukraine-Russia conflict started almost 3 years back. The Chinese and Indian oil refiners are likely to now seek alternative source of crude from the Middle East, Africa and other areas, which of course is likely to lead to a surge in oil prices. There will be higher freight costs and of course the prices of crude will be higher, which is why probably it's responding. The markets seem to be responding to this news with oil prices surging to $81 a barrel as markets reacted to the looming potential for supply disruptions. Even as the rupee, the Indian rupee, fell to an all-time low of 86 against the US dollar. Now, why is this significant? This is significant because India imports over 80% of its oil needs. So we import and pay in dollar terms. So if the rupee becomes is getting depreciated, it means that for the same amount of crude oil that we import, we've got to pay more in our Indian currency, which is why it's sort of a double whammy for us. On one end, there could be some sort of a disruption in terms of supply lines, making it more expensive. And on the other end, because the Indian rupee is depreciating, it will cost us that much more. And that's why we are asking our big questions this evening first, as far as what this means for India. The first question that we are asking is, will India bear the brunt of Russian sanctions? Remember, over 30% of India's oil needs are now being met by Russian oil. Now, how will we get impacted is the first question that we are asking today. The second key question is, what will be the next alternatives that India has? Remember, a couple of years before the Iranian sanctions came into play, Iran actually contributed very large amount for our supply. That is not an option now. If Russia's oil is also not an option, then what is our option? That's the second key question that we are asking. And the third important is, how will the falling rupee have an impact in terms of the overall amount of money that India will have to pay? And that's the question that I'll put to both the guests joining me today. And Professor Anuradha Chenoy, who's from, she's joining, and she's from JNU, and I have Dr. Asif Iqbal, from a foreign trade expert as well. Thank you so much for joining me on what I feel is not just a foreign policy or an economic issue, but it's a long-term geopolitical, geo-economic issue that we need to discuss. And Dr. Asif, let me start by asking you, and then I get in Professor Anuradha as well, which is that how do you read the present situation unfolding for India? Do you see the possibility of maneuvering the present sanctions as we've been able to do so far? Or do you think now the sanctions are very widespread, very deep, and escaping them would probably be, or being able to find loopholes would be more difficult for India going forward?
Thank you. Well, I feel that this is there's a big challenge for both India and China now that we will be looking at importing most of the Indian refiners now will start looking at Africa, the Middle East, and they'll be sourcing more oil from these regions, including the United States. Therefore, the price will be boosted, and the freight costs also. Because I believe that the supplies to Moscow's top customers are going to be affected using this. And I believe that out of 520 barrels, 520 shipments, 300 have come to India and the rest have gone to China out of 530 million barrels. And I believe that this is going to be a very big challenge, and we have to see how it uncovers in the next few days by India trying to sign and make some new arrangements with the Middle East and with the African nations.
Okay, Professor Anuradha, then let me ask you this. How do you see this situation unfolding? The fact that these sanctions, some of them have been in place the last 3 years. There have been EU sanctions, there have been UK sanctions, and of course the most widespread being US. But the top-ups that came over the weekend, they seem to be widespread. Do you see that having a major impact on India, or do you see there are opportunities for India to be able to find India-specific solutions, so to say?
Well, look, so far, India had negotiated with the United States that they could bypass those secondary sanctions, CATSA, which the sanctions are being imposed on Russia, but not on India's imports. So that's how India had bypassed. And just last year, Indian imports of oil from Russia, crude oil, went up by 4.5%. So India will have to see and pressurize the US to allow them these exemptions. They've also sanctioned the shipping fleets. That means insurance, etc. So it's a complicated set of sanctions. It's very wrong of Biden in his last week as lame duck president to have imposed this. But the whole purpose is to push US oil. Now, US is a major producer of oil, and that they want to push that to Europe. And India was getting this crude, refining it, putting it into the whole barrel, and then re-exporting it to Europe. That's how India was working. So India will have to, as it is, they get 36%. So 73% was from other sources. And I think the US is putting pressure that we should buy American oil, which will be much more expensive.
Professor Anuradha, which brings me to ask you that if the purpose and the primary goal is to push US oil, US is a large exporter, large manufacturer when it comes to crude oil, the fact that if that is the ultimate goal of this policy, it's unlikely that Trump 2.0 will reverse any of it, because that's what the premise of his entire campaign so far has been, hasn't it?
Correct. But the other thing is that India was buying Russian oil with Indian rupees. So as you mentioned, that the Indian rupee versus the dollar, it has gone up. It's volatile. So India was, gaining even from that we will be able to get Russian oil for Indian rupees. And so I think India is very specifically being targeted, and these tariffs are going to be increasing. But India will have to be firm, tough, and negotiate of how they can bypass this. And continue this trade on oil in Indian rupees, because India had gained a lot, and India is a major oil importer, because there is going to be a tough stance even from Trump, because
Absolutely.
he's going to push this in order to gain leverage on Russia.
Absolutely,
if he has
this is
any
leverage,
talks.
and he would like to have that leverage not just on Russia but possibly on India as well. But Dr. Asif, then do you share Professor Anuradha's opinion, what she said, that India at some level is being targeted here? And what do you see could be the possible options, if at all there are any on the table?
Well, I think India is going to be having to renegotiate more like a preferential kind of a sanction, so that it does not completely affect only the oil trade. Because initially, when the United States wanted to impose the sanctions, it was focused more towards the, the binary usage of the items that were used for the war, like semiconductors. There was a high priority list that they had, compiled, and said the sanctions would be only against them for India. And we had abided by that. Semiconductors, machine tools, integrated circuits, and all such items that would be used for the war against Ukraine. However, now this whole thing about sanction against the oil, and if you see it has touched $80 after touching $81 today, the per barrel price. So it is going to be a lot of interest to the global players who are trading into oil, and I believe that it is going to touch $85 in the next few days.
Okay, that's not a very positive scenario, because $85 if the oil goes, if the rupee has a certain downward pressure right now, it just makes our oil purchase more expensive. Professor Anuradha,
but there's one more thing the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she wanted to put a cap of $60 per barrel.
Yeah.
So the Russians could negotiate, and instead of buying, right now American oil is $71 a barrel. If they push their prices down and adhere to the cap, then maybe they could do it. But there are a lot of complex negotiations involved in this now for India and for Russia and for the rest.
Which brings me to ask you that as things stand right now, Trump 2.0 presidency starts in just about a week's time. Is there a way to be able to, New Delhi's options in terms of being able to reach out to the Trump administration to talk about these sanctions, the kind of impact they could have? Because, this is not just about the oil trade, right? This has a larger messaging there, right? And how can New Delhi sort of reach out to Trump 2.0 and ensure that it doesn't have the impact in terms of the overall relationship?
Yeah, is that to me? Okay,
yeah, that's to you.
Trump, he is a very transactional but somewhat irrational, unpredictable kind of person. But he has, even in his last long interview and press conference, said he wants to end the war in between Ukraine and Russia, and that would mean maybe easing some sanctions. So, of course, Russia will push for that. They're also interested, and India doesn't want to be touched with these secondary sanctions. It will be good for all these economies, including the American economies, if they turn down the sanctions to some extent, but they will not do so until they get what they show as a victory, some kind of victory in this war. But
exactly.
I expect, negotiations
exactly.
to start
Dr. Asif,
soon.
quick closing comments on specifically in terms of options for New Delhi?
Well, now I believe that our stand has to be a little more realigned, because now, especially when our foreign minister goes to to the swearing in the next 4 days, I'm sure they are going to be taking a call, and he will have some good news that will be very good to our ears.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking out the time, speaking to me on a very important geo-economic, geopolitical issue as far as crude oil is concerned.